He was sitting alone in a dim backstage room, the kind where the walls seemed to absorb every echo of a life once filled with applause. At 78, Bill Bailey had the calm of a man who had walked through both brilliance and bruises. Yet that afternoon, when the light slanted across his face, something in his expression carried the weight of an older, quieter truth. He breathed slowly, as if choosing each word with the same care he once reserved for a punchline, then murmured a sentence that froze the room around him. "I will never forgive 5 people. 5 faces I still see when the nights are too quiet." The air thickened. Outside, the muffled hum of a studio faded into distance. Inside, his voice dropped to a whisper, half confession, half lament. It wasn't anger that shaped his tone. No, it was something deeper, a tired sadness that comes only after decades of trying to forget. His hands trembled slightly over an old wooden table, tracing invisible lines, as though mapping the memories he had avoided for years. For a man celebrated for humor, music, and warmth, the revelation felt almost unreal. But behind every laugh he ever offered the world, there had always been a shadow, one he had kept carefully out of sight. The shadow of 5 stories, 5 betrayals, 5 wounds time never managed to erase. And now, after a lifetime of silence, he was ready to open the first door. But who were they, these 5 figures lingering in the dim corridors of his memory? The room seemed to hold its breath as Bill let the past rise again, slowly, reluctantly, like dust drifting up from an old attic. To understand why a man reaches 78 with 5 unforgiven names carved into his memory, one must return to the quiet streets of Bath, where William Bailey was once just a thin, observant boy with hair too long for local taste and a silence too deep for his age. The world around him was modest: rows of terraced houses, the distant chime of church bells, and evenings soaked in the amber glow of aging streetlights. But beneath that gentleness lay the first fracture of his life. His father, a kind but distant medical practitioner, spent long nights with patients, leaving little room for the emotional presence a child often needs. His mother, gentle yet often overwhelmed, oscillated between affection and exhaustion. Bill grew up between them, learning early how to read shifts in tone, the quick tremor in his mother's voice, the softened footsteps of his father returning home past midnight. In that household, love existed, but it arrived in waves, sometimes warm, sometimes withdrawn. He sought refuge in music. A worn-out acoustic guitar, half-tuned and missing a string, became his secret companion. But even in the sanctuary of melody, he sometimes sensed the trembling edge of insecurity. At school, he played the clown to avoid being the target. Humor became both shield and salvation. Yet the laughter he provoked often hid a loneliness no one seemed to notice. There were children who mocked his oddness, teachers who dismissed his creativity, and one particular betrayal, small but sharp, that lodged itself deep. A childhood friend who suddenly turned against him, joining others in a cruel chorus of ridicule. That was the first time Bill felt the sting of trust breaking. A subtle fracture, yet it shaped him profoundly. As adolescence swept in, the rifts widened. His growing passion for eccentricity clashed with the expectations of a conservative environment. He learned to smile through misunderstandings, to swallow hurt, to turn disappointment into jokes. But beneath each forced laugh, a seed of resentment took root, quiet, persistent, waiting. When Bill stepped into adulthood, the world unfolded before him in 2 conflicting shades, one shimmering with possibility, the other still carrying the long shadow of his childhood insecurities. Yet it was precisely this mixture that would shape the artist the public later adored. From dim, smoky pubs in Bristol to the narrow stages along the Thames, Bill discovered a kind of illumination he never knew he needed: the light of the stage. The moment that first ripple of laughter rose from a crowd, he felt something shift. Here among strangers, he was no longer the boy hiding behind a guitar. He was a voice, and life began to move faster. Performances multiplied, invitations followed. The name Bill Bailey started echoing like a spark traveling through the comedy circuit. He blended humor with music, satire with tenderness, intellect with a kind of absurdity so precise it became poetry. Audiences laughed, applauded, rose to their feet as if they never wanted him to stop. But every night spent under that brilliant glare was followed by a quiet night alone, returning to a still room where he sometimes wondered whether the joy he gave away could truly fill the empty spaces inside him. Fame brought light, but it also brought its shadows. Expectations grew heavier. Eyes watched more closely. Bill met people who admired him, people who envied him, and people who hovered around him like moths drawn not to him, but to the glow around his name. Some old friends drifted away. Some turned their backs after believing in rumors that spread faster than truth. In a world expanding at a relentless pace, he learned to smile for the cameras but grow cautious when the dressing room door closed. The first deep crack appeared when Bill trusted a fellow performer, someone he considered a creative soulmate. They had spent long nights writing jokes on trains slicing through London, sharing dreams of bigger shows and better stages. Until one morning, Bill watched his own idea, one he had nurtured for months, appear on television under another man's name. No explanation, no apology, only the cold silence of someone who had taken what wasn't his. Bill didn't erupt. He didn't sue. He didn't retaliate. He simply stood backstage, watching the lights rise without the presence of someone who once felt like a brother and felt a small door inside him close. It wasn't the last betrayal he would face, but it was the one that taught him the first brutal lesson. Success always extracts a price. From that moment on, Bill understood something he would carry for decades. Success is not only the privilege of being seen, it is the burden of enduring those waiting in the shadows, hoping for a chance to push you back into the dark. There comes a moment in an artist's life when the light no longer saves them, but instead reflects everything they have tried so hard to bury. For Bill, that moment didn't arrive with a single dramatic blow. It came through a long stretch of silence, pulling him slowly from the height of laughter into rooms so dim that even the sound of his own breath felt distant. After years on stage, Bill began to notice a painful pattern. The people he trusted most were often the ones who made him question the goodness he once believed in. A major television program he had poured his heart into was abruptly canceled without warning. Weeks later, he discovered, by pure accident, that the producers he had treated like family had quietly replaced him with a younger, more marketable face. The decision was masked behind a cold, polished phrase, "a new direction." He still remembers that day with painful clarity. The conference room lit by sterile white lights, the familiar faces of colleagues who had toasted with him through countless after-show nights, now staring at folders, avoiding his eyes. No one dared say they had abandoned him. But in truth, silence hurt far more than any confession would have. And when he walked out of that building, he felt his footsteps hollow, as if he had left a piece of his youth on the staircase behind him. The rupture didn't end there. A mentor, someone who once encouraged him to pursue music, suddenly turned his back, dismissing Bill's style as too eccentric, too strange to have a future. Spoken publicly, those words stunned him. It wasn't fear of failure that struck him. It was the realization that the man he admired most could so easily erase years of belief with a single sentence. From these layered wounds, Bill began to understand that some losses aren't born from conflict, but from the coldness of those who once made us believe they would never walk away. And it was in those quiet, painful hours that the first names, the ones he would never forgive, began to take shape in the dim corridors of his memory. 5 names, 5 betrayals, 5 echoes that never faded, no matter how many stages he crossed or how many audiences rose to applaud him. At 78, Bill Bailey speaks of them not with anger, but with a quiet firmness, like someone who has carried their weight for so long that letting them go would feel like betraying the truth itself. He pauses before each story, as though reopening old doors he once swore to keep locked. The friend who broke the circle, the gentle wound. The first name is uttered almost like a sigh. This was someone who entered Bill's life early, in the fragile years when friendship feels holy and loyalty unquestioned. They shared songs, shared secrets, shared afternoons, dreaming of future, neither of them fully understood yet. But one day, without warning, that friend drifted into a new crowd. People who mocked Bill for being strange, too musical, too different. Instead of defending him, the friend joined in, laughing the loudest. It was a small betrayal in the eyes of the world, but in the heart of a boy still learning how to belong, it was enough to crack something delicate. Bill says he never confronted him. He simply learned too early that affection can vanish faster than it arrives. The collaborator who stole his voice? The unexpected wound. The second name comes with a sharper breath. This was the colleague Bill once considered a creative brother. They wrote together, toured together, shared the grind of small venues and cold evenings. Bill trusted him with ideas he had not yet dared to speak aloud. One of those ideas, a concept Bill had been shaping for months, appeared on national television under the collaborator's name alone. Bill watched it from a backstage monitor, stunned, realizing that the person he admired had taken his work and turned it into personal glory. No apology ever followed, just silence. For Bill, this was the first real fracture of adulthood, the moment he understood that the brightest stages also cast the darkest shadows. The mentor who undermined him. The deep wound. The third person cut deeper than the rest. A mentor. The man who once encouraged him to pursue comedy, who praised his oddness as originality, who told him that the world needed voices like his. But success has a strange way of shifting loyalties. When Bill began experimenting with blending music and humor, an approach that would later become his signature, the mentor dismissed him publicly. Too eccentric, too theatrical. He'll burn out. Those words, spoken casually in an interview, spread quickly. They weren't just criticism, they were a withdrawal of faith from someone Bill had placed on a pedestal. And because admiration magnifies disappointment, this wound became one of the deepest. The institution that erased him. The public wound. The fourth name is not a person, but an entire establishment. The producers who replaced him without a word. Bill had poured his heart into shaping a show with them, writing, rehearsing, even rearranging his tour schedule to give it life. Then one day the project vanished from the lineup, and a younger performer stepped into his role. The decision came wrapped in formal language, new direction, creative shift, fresh audience appeal. But Bill felt the truth beneath it. He had been deemed replaceable. It wasn't rejection that hurt. Rejection is part of every artist's life. What haunted him was the silence, the way no one met his eyes, no one offered honesty, no one acknowledged the years he had given. It was the moment he stopped believing in professional loyalty. After sharing these four names, Bill grows quiet. His eyes lower, his voice softens. The fifth name is different, himself, the unbearable wound. The last person, he finally whispers, the one I will never truly forgive, is me. There is no melodrama in his tone, only truth, steady and unavoidable. He blames himself for all the moments he stayed silent when he should have spoken, for trusting people who saw him only as an opportunity, for letting insecurity shape his choices, for holding on to pain because it was easier than facing it. He blames himself for shrinking when he should have stood tall, for laughing off wounds that deserved to be acknowledged, for carrying guilt that never belonged to him. Bill doesn't say this with self-pity. He says it like a man who has lived long enough to recognize that sometimes the harshest judgment comes from within. The first four names shaped his life, but the fifth, his own, has defined it. And perhaps, he murmurs, forgiving myself would mean letting all the others go. But I'm not there yet. The room falls silent. 5 stories linger in the air, like dust catching the last light of evening. Evening settled slowly around him, the way twilight drapes itself over a quiet house that has seen too many years, too many stories. Bill sat there for a long moment, letting the weight of his own confession dissolve into the muted air. The studio outside had faded into silence. Only the soft hum of an old lamp and the ticking of a distant clock remained. They marked time gently, as if careful not to disturb the tenderness of what he had just revealed. He reached for a small object on the table, an aged guitar pick, worn smooth from decades of playing. It wasn't valuable, not in the way the world measures worth, but it carried every stage, every song, every night he stood beneath lights that felt warmer than the people who once gathered around him. He turned it between his fingers, his expression caught somewhere between longing and acceptance. I suppose, he whispered, We all live with ghosts, some louder than others. The room held the softness of a final breath. He wasn't searching for forgiveness anymore, not from the four who had hurt him, and not even from the fifth name he had finally spoken aloud. What he searched for, slowly, cautiously, was a kind of peace, fragile but possible, hovering at the edges of his memory like the last notes of a fading melody. He lifted his gaze, eyes reflecting something that was not sorrow, not quite hope, but a quiet understanding. And in that subdued half-light, two questions rose, unanswered, lingering, meant only for those who had listened. Can a life truly be lived without forgiveness? Or must we sometimes hold on to our wounds, if only to remember how deeply we once loved?